I wholeheartedly welcome Vivek Kaul to this webinar. I'm extremely happy that he has agreed to speak in our webinar this Friday. A lot of crowd is there. They're excited to join. We are equally excited to have you here from the side of ICFI Academics. Professor R. Prasad is also joined. He's going to be one of the moderators. Today, what I'll do is I'll share my screen and do a little bit of introduction and then hand it over back to you, Mr. Vivek Kaul. Oh, this is the Wise Views interactive webinar series, 10th in its series. We have completed 9 such leadership talks in the past, and this is the 10th one. And I take pleasure in announcing that we have Mr. Vivek Kaul with us. He's going to talk about the big bad world of bad money. The agenda is about 30 minutes of talk by Mr. Vivek Kaul and followed by another 30 minutes of interaction based on the questions keyed in by the participants at the time of registration, and also some of the questions that might come up during the conversation, during the chat. In the chat, they will be mentioning their questions. So that also will be picked up for Q&A. This is Mr. Vivek Kaul, and he does not need any introduction. He's quite popular. As far as I'm concerned, personally, I'm quite a big follower. I read lots of his articles, and today he's with us, therefore the excitement. He's a widely published writer on economics and finance who has been widely quoted in The Economist, Wall Street Journal, and the BBC. He delivered guest lectures to students of various premier B schools like IIM Ahmedabad, Bangalore, Kozhikode, Indore, Ranchi, Visakhapatnam, TIS Hyderabad, and many more. He has authored 5 books. His latest, Bad Money Inside the NPA Mess and How It Threatens the Indian banking system. I purchased this last week. I've gone through this book. I've also read the trilogy of Easy Money, the evolution of money from Robinson Crusoe to the First World War, the evolution of global financial system to the great bubble burst, and the third one in Easy Money, the greatest Ponzi scheme ever, and how it threatens to destroy the global financial system, all the 3. So I managed to read 1+1, that is 3+1, 4 books. He's a regular columnist for the Mint and the Deccan Herald, among other publications. One important thing I want to mention here that Mr. Vivek Kaul was a PhD scholar with ICFI in the year 2002 to 2005, which I came to know last evening. I was not aware of this prior to last evening. I was very happy to note that. And he discontinued his PhD program. So on this brief introduction, I once again welcome Mr. Vivek Kaul to start the talk. And thank you very much for being with us. Mr. Vivek Kaul.
Thank you, sir. And thanks for having me over. So, first of all, I mean, I stay in Mumbai and in a very small apartment. So if there are any background noises, I'm not responsible. So, today, basically, I'll be talking about, the big bad world of bad money. And before I get into it, I think it's important to first define as to what bad money exactly is. Bad money basically is essentially, loans of banks which haven't been repaid for a period of 90 days or more at a very, very basic level. Now, when I started writing the book, I couldn't have called the book Bad Loans because, then nobody would have bought it. So one needed a fancier title, and that is how bad loans essentially became bad money, which is which at the cost of repetition essentially means the total amount of loans which have not been repaid for a period of 90 days or more. So to put it in a very retail perspective, if you have taken a loan from a bank and you default on 3 EMIs, okay, so then your loan gets categorized as a bad loan. So now, to give you some background, sometime in February 2018, I was at the Symbiosis University campus in Pune. I was going there to sort of teach the students of journalism. And so the campus is, for those of you who have probably, who've been there would know that it's a very beautiful campus, basically built on a hill. And the best part of that campus is that the guest house is at the top of the hill. So you get to sort of see a lot of natural beauty in and around Pune. Anyway, so as I was being driven up from a from a journalist belonging to a popular Hindi newspaper, and he wanted me to write a piece on bad loans of banks. Now, I found that very surprising, given that bad loans of banks had been around for a period of almost 5 years up until then. I mean, I had been at least writing about it for 5 years, and no Hindi press, or for that matter, any other Indian language press, had approached me to write a piece on it. And by then, the bad loans of the banks had already crossed 8 lakh crore. So 8 lakh crore is not a small amount. Now that got me, after I told him that, I would I would be happy to write a piece. I essentially got thinking about the point that, why does he want me to write a piece now? What has changed? And the thought that came to my mind immediately was the fact that Nirav Modi had essentially, escaped from India, and his scam with the Punjab National Bank had come to light a few weeks back, wherein he had defaulted, or rather he had siphoned off, defaulted is not the right word here, where he had cheated the bank of around 12,645 crore rupees and then disappeared. So what happened? So what that told me was that, the press now had a face to put to the scam. Okay. Now there is a concept in psychology. It's called identified life. Now, and economists have also sort of adopted that concept. I mean, like, a lot of economists steal from psychology and then pass it off as economics. So this concept has also been sort of stolen from psychology, and it is widely used in economics now. So the concept of identified life is very, very simple. Uh, as the old cliche goes, that that million lives are a statistic, but one death is a tragedy. So to give you a good example, a few years back, a picture of a young Syrian kid called Aylan Kurdi, whose dead body was washed off and was on a beach, made it to the media worldwide. And so that one picture did more to the cause of Syrian migrants in Europe than all the statistics that were being offered in the media up until then. Or to give you a very recent example, India started waking up to the dangers of the COVID pandemic only after Amitabh Bachchan got it. Now, up until then, there were lakhs of people who had already got or who had already suffered from the disease, but people were not taking it seriously. But when, after Mr. Bachchan got it, a certain amount of seriousness started to creep in. So there are a lot of such examples which essentially tell you what identified life versus a statistical life is. So similarly, if you look at the entire bad money, bad loans problem, only once Nirav Modi sort of defaulted, or siphoned off money and escaped from the country, did the general public wake up to the fact that, okay, boss, our public sector banks are in trouble. They are in big trouble, in fact. So what happened was, by March 2018, the bad loans of public sector banks had already amounted to around 8.96 lakh crore, whereas the overall bad loans were at around 10.36 lakh crore. So it was a huge problem by then. Now, the question that obviously comes to our minds is that how did this happen? Okay. And who are the people responsible for it? Now, one of the questions that I used to at least regularly ask in my live talks was that who is the biggest defaulter of them all? Okay. And till date, nobody has given me the right answer. And so remind me to, give you the right answer at the end of the presentation, so that, at least, that's one way of ensuring that people listen to me right up until the end, however boring I may be. So anyway, so when I started researching on the topic, and when I started working on the book, one of the thoughts, and I mean, not a great thought, but one of the thoughts in my head was that a lot of this must have happened because of crony capitalism, right? I mean, when you and I, when we talk, or when we talk over a cup of tea or coffee, uh, that's the first thing that we talk about. Okay, this has happened because of the nexus between politicians and businessmen. And that was the thought with which I went into the book. Now, how do you look at the problem of crony capitalism from the theoretical point of view. Okay. Now, there is an American economist called Thomas Sowell, and Thomas Sowell talks about this concept of distinction between knowledge and power. And it's a very simple concept, but a very powerful concept. And what that concept essentially says is that problems crop up when people who have the power to make a decision do not have the knowledge to make it, or people who have the knowledge to make a decision do not have the power to make it. Okay. Now, how does this fit in the context of bad money or bad loans? So if you look at retail loans, now retail loans are essentially loans that people, you and I, take. Home loans, personal loans, credit card receivables, loans against fixed deposits, auto loans, education loans. These are all retail loans. Now, if you look at the bad loans rate of retail loans of public sector banks, it is at it used to be at around 2%. And this is not very, hugely different from the bad loans rate of retail loans of private banks. Whereas if you look at the bad loan rates of loans given to industry or loans given to corporates, that for public sector banks was more than 20%. Now, why is there so much difference in the bad loans rate of these different kind of loans? And the reason for that lies in the fact that when a public sector banker is giving a retail loan, he has the knowledge and the power to decide whether he has to give that loan or not. He can look at different papers, he can look at your salary slips, and stuff. He can look at your bank account statement and figure out whether this guy has the potential or rather is in the position to repay the loan that he will be taking on. Whereas when the same guy goes out and gives a corporate loan, he may have the knowledge to sort of give the, to decide whether this businessman should be given the loan or not. But at the same time, he may not be able to make that decision because there might be, his bosses may want something else. There might be politicians involved, or the businessmen themselves might be very powerful. So this is what creates the problem. Now, so from a theoretical point of view, I was fine. I was on a sound footing. But the problem then was that how do you write about crony capitalism in a foolproof way without getting legal notices and without getting sued? Because how do you establish that there was a quid pro quo? The loan was given in lieu of some other favor. I mean, how do you establish that? So it's very difficult to establish that. And this is something that Dr. Raghuram Rajan also sort of talked about. So he said, once a loan has been given, it is very difficult that to establish whether it was corruption or whether it was something else. So as to quote him, undoubtedly there was some corruption, but it is hard to tell banker exuberance, incompetence, and corruption apart. So what is what? How do you separate? Also, what happened was, as I sort of got deeper into the book and sort of researched it a little more, I realized that, it was not just about crony capitalism. I mean, I'm sure there was some crony capitalism involved, even though we may not be able to establish it easily. Also, we have not made efforts to establish it. I mean, that is also there. So what else was happening? And again, to give you some theoretical framework. So there used to be an American economist called Hyman Minsky, who the world rediscovered post the financial crisis of 2008. And one of his theorems essentially, or one of his hypotheses, was the financial instability hypothesis. And to sort of, and without really getting into the technical part of it, what this hypothesis essentially states is that stability leads to instability. So to sort of simplify it even further, when we are in a good position in life, we sort of assume that good position will continue, and the mistakes that we make when we are in a good position essentially lead us to a bad position. So to give you an example, something which has played out in the last 15 months. So a lot of youngsters have lost out on jobs, and at the same time they are in debt. And this has happened because they sort of assume that their jobs are not going to go anywhere, and they can borrow and then they can repay it at a later date. But then the pandemic happened and things changed. So stability led to instability. Or to give you a very recent example, I mean, those of you who sort of follow my writing would know that I do not have a very high opinion of either Bitcoin or any other cryptocurrency. So a lot of people, when you talk to all the Bitcoin and crypto believers, I mean, I haven't seen anyone else believe in things as much as they do. And the moment your belief becomes your identity, you are in a problem. But then that's a different topic for a different day. So what happened with a lot of these guys was that a lot of them assumed that this is going to go up forever, and then it touched some $63,000, and a lot of people got in at that point of time, assuming that the good times will continue, and then it fell, and then right now it's at probably $33,000. I mean, the volatility is huge. As I speak, it might have fallen by another 2-3%, or it might have gone up by 5%. Who knows? So the point I'm trying to make is that stability leads to instability. Now, how is this? How does all this fit into the big bad world of bad money? Between 2004 and 2006, I mean, this has been a while back. When I was at ICFI trying to do my PhD, between 2004 and 2006, India grew by 9% in each of the 3 years. And this is the only occasion when India has grown by more than 9% for 3 years consecutively. So what happened was that, those were the good days, and everyone assumed that these good days will continue forever. India will be the next China, and there will be there is a lot of potential in the economy. And because of that, a lot of a lot of businessmen ended up borrowing a lot of money. And this was done to build power plants, infrastructure, real estate, steel plants, cement plants, textile mills, so on and so forth. Because, the assumption was that, as the economy keeps expanding, as we keep growing at 9-10% and become the next China, all these assets will be required, and then, a lot of money will be made. Also, it was not just the businessmen falling over one another to borrow a lot of money. Banks were also falling over one another to give out loans. And again, this is on record, and Dr. Rajan has a great quote on it. He in one of his speeches, he recounted a story of a story that a business promoter told him. And to quote Dr. Rajan, he said, that is the promoter, was pursued then by banks waving checkbooks, asking him to name the amount he wanted. So a lot of loans were given out, and a lot of loans were taken. Now, what then happened was, what spoiled the party was the financial crisis of 2008, when globally financial institutions ran into a lot of trouble, financial markets crashed, and central banks and governments had to rescue a lot of big Western financial institutions like AIG, the biggest insurance company in the world, Goldman Sachs, so you name it. Lehman Brothers, the fourth largest investment bank on Wall Street, went bust. Now, this sent the global economy into a crisis, and economic activity suffered because of that. Now, India did not have a problem, and that is primarily because as soon as the crisis started, two big things happened. The first thing that happened was that the government started spending a lot of money. So, this essentially goes back to what the British economist John Maynard Keynes called the paradox of thrift. And what that paradox of thrift essentially says is that, what if one man decides to save more money, that's a great thing. But if the society as a whole decides not to spend money and to save it, then it is a problem, because ultimately one man's spending is another man's income. And so when something like this happened, Keynes had suggested that when the private economy is not spending, when individuals are not spending, then the government needs to sort of come in and start spending money, so that economic activity happens and economic growth comes back. So the Indian government started spending a lot of money. And the second thing that happened was that Pranab Mukherjee became the finance minister, I think sometime in January 2009. Before that, Manmohan Singh had the finance ministry portfolio. I mean, not a lot of people would remember that, but he had the finance ministry portfolio briefly, and he had to, I think, go in for some sort of a cardiac surgery, and because of that, Manmohan Singh took over the finance portfolio. Pranab Mukherjee took over the finance portfolio, and there was this entire thing that where public sector banks were asked to continue their lending binge, and public sector banks continued to lend. Now, what happened was that because of the government spending, we soon had inflation which went into double digits. I mean, I don't know how many of you would remember, but inflation in 10, 11, 11, 12 was more than 10%. And what that did in turn was that once inflation was greater than 10%, interest rates also had to rise. So interest rates then were more than 10%. Obviously, interest rates usually, not in the world that we live in, but usually tend to be more than the rate of inflation. Uh, Now, the problem was the entrepreneurs, the businessmen who had taken on all these loans had to repay these loans at a higher rate of interest. But a lot of their projects never really got off the mark. And the reasons, there were various reasons for it. In many cases, they couldn't get the land they wanted. In some cases, there was no environmental clearance. Then non-environmental clearances did not happen. There were some policy problems. And in some cases, the entrepreneurs themselves were to be blamed because they couldn't get in an adequate amount of equity into the project, or rather an adequate amount of their own money into the project. Now, imagine the situation of an entrepreneur where he has borrowed for a project and he has not been able to repay, and he's not been able to start the project. So if he has not been able to start the project, obviously he's not making money. There is no cash flow. Uh, and he has to repay the loan at a higher rate of interest. So obviously very soon defaults started to happen. So a lot of these defaults started in 2011 and happened between 2011 and 2014. But they were not recognized as defaults because the RBI practiced what it calls regulatory forbearance, which it is doing even right now, where it decided to look the other way, and banks did not recognize their bad loans as bad loans, and they kicked the can down the road. Now, how did they do that? There were essentially two ways. The first way is called evergreening, wherein what you do is you issue a fresh loan to the businessman so that he can use the money coming in from the fresh loan to repay the last loan that he had taken on, and that essentially ensures that he does not default. And technically he's not defaulting, but he has defaulted because he's taken on a fresh loan to repay the last loan. That was one way. The other way was restructuring of the loan, wherein in some cases interest was waived off, in some cases interest was cut down, in some cases principal repayment was postponed, and so on and so forth. So all this continued between 2011 and 2014. And the first time that the RBI came down hard on bad loans was in November 2014, when Dr. Raghuram Rajan gave the Varghese Kurian Memorial Lecture in Anand. And that was the first time that you sort of came to realize that the RBI is now taking the problem very seriously. And soon they had an asset quality review where banks were basically forced to recognize their bad loans as bad loans. And then over a period of time, over the next 3 years, the bad loans kept going up till they peaked at 10.36 lakh crore in March 2018. Now, so this is how the entire story played out. Now, obviously, what is the cost of it? How are you and I paying for it? Because we don't even realize that we are paying for it. Now, given the fact that a lot of these banks lost a lot of money, they still didn't shut down, right? I mean, it's not like they defaulted. Typically, for a bank to repay its deposits, its loans need to be repaid. If it does not, if all the loans are not repaid, the bank obviously is not in a position to repay all the deposits. But none of the banks, public sector banks, have ever defaulted on their deposits. And the reason for that lies in the fact that the government constantly keeps putting fresh money into it. And whenever a government puts money into a bank, obviously it is money being taken away from something else, right? There's only so much amount of money going around. So that's one way that we've paid for. Other way we have paid for it is what is called privatization by malign neglect. Now, the Indian banks, the government hasn't privatized Indian public sector banks, though it's sort of started the process now. But the Indian banking sector is getting privatized, irrespective of whether the government is privatizing these banks or not. Now, why do I say that? I say that because in 2010-11, around 10 years back, public sector banks gave out 75% of the loans in India. In 2021, as of March 2021, public sector banks gave out only 57% of the loans. And the share that they have lost has been captured by the private banks. And there is something very, very interesting even within that, that the State Bank of India has not lost any market share, or it has lost a very insignificant amount of market share. It is the non-state bank public sector banks which have lost the market share. And this is the share which has been captured by the private banks. This is privatization by malign neglect. When it comes to deposits, public sector banks had around 75% of deposits. That is now down to around 61-62%. So irrespective of whether the banks are being privatized or not, the banking sector is getting privatized. And the same story which played out with the telecom sector, where MTNL and BSNL were never privatized, but the telecom sector got fully privatized. Air India was never privatized, but the airline sector got fully privatized. And so this basically, to talk the language that MBA students understand, a huge destruction of value has happened. And ultimately, we as the citizens of this nation are paying for it. Then the third point, and this is a pretty interesting point, that if you look at the market capitalization of State Bank of India, and I just checked this earlier in the day today, the market capitalization is 3.8 lakh crore. If you check the market capitalization of Kotak Mahindra Bank, it is 3.4 lakh crore. Kotak Mahindra Bank is a bank which is around 10% the size of the State Bank of India, and they have more or less the similar market capitalization. In fact, till around last year, the market capitalization of Kotak Mahindra Bank was greater than that of State Bank of India. It is only in the last 1 year that stock prices of public sector banks have gone up, and because of that, SBI's valuation is more than that of Kotak Mahindra Bank. In fact, last year, the market cap of just HDFC Bank used to be much more than all the non-SBI public sector banks. I mean, I haven't made this calculation lately, so I can't comment offhand, but this is how it used to be. Now, how does this hurt? Now, it hurts primarily because, if you look at what has happened in the last 1 year or last 15 months, when the amount of taxes earned by the government have fallen dramatically, and the government is really running short on resources, and which is why petrol prices are at 100 rupees a liter or more than that, because the taxes on the central government taxes on petrol and diesel have gone up dramatically in the last 1 year. So how would, let's say the State Bank of India was properly run, or let's say all the other public sector banks were properly run and they had proper market capitalization. All the government needed to do was sell some of these shares in the stock market, raise the money, and then spend it to fight the COVID pandemic. So this is how you lose out. Now, what is the way around it? Because we are all used to, given that in India we grow up writing exams from day one, and in exams every question has a right answer. So we are used to talking solutions even when there are none. So let me give you a solution to this. The solution to this is what is called the Axis Bank model. Now, Axis Bank, when it was launched originally, was called UTI Bank. And even though it was a bank which was owned by the public sector, I mean, the institutions that owned it were all public sector institutions. It had a license for being run as a private sector bank. And given that, over the years, it has been in the recent past, there have been problems, but it has been a relatively much better run bank than all the non-SBI public sector banks. And because of that, it has had a significant amount of market capitalization in the stock market. And because of that, the government has been able to sell its shares over the years and raise money through the process. So the need of the R is that the government act as a shareholder and not as a business owner. Now, people obviously come around and ask me when I make this suggestion is then, but what about the social objectives of the government? The government has a lot of social objectives. So the government cannot be seen 100% as a business, right? So the social objectives have to be fulfilled, and which is where a lot of these public sector institutions come in. Now, the answer to that is very, very simple. The social objectives of the government should not be mixed with the public sector. So let's say if all these public sector banks were well run, the government could still meet its social objectives by incentivizing these banks to do the things that the government wants them to do. So let's say, the government wants the banks to open Jan Dhan accounts. So instead of forcing them to do so, it could incentivize them by paying them a certain amount of money for every account that is opened. Now the question is, where would that money come from? The money would come from selling the shares that the government has in these banks. And why would the government be able to sell these shares? The government would be able to sell these shares because these banks are run as proper businesses. They would have the right kind of valuation in the stock market, and it would be easy for the government to sell these, a small amount, and to keep the entire thing going for a long time. So yeah, so this is what I think I have. It's 7 o'clock. I have almost stuck to my time.
Yeah, thank you very much, Vivek. I think it's pretty interesting, and you can go on and on. But we will lace it with the questions, and probably at that opportune moment, you can add those points which you have missed, because these questions will act as triggers and it will help us be participative as well. Thank you very much. I think everything centers around that quote: stability leads to instability. The more stable things become and the longer things are stable, the more unstable they will be when the crisis hits.
Right.
Hyman Minsky, which we shared in our social media post as well.
Oh, okay.
Thank you very much. Now I bring in and request Professor R. Prasad. Professor R. Prasad is the director of academic wing at ICFI Group. He is the professor and course mentor for the newly launched online MBA program. He is the architect of the program. He has got a rich experience of 3 decades, both at the corporate level as well as at the academic level. And he has been anchoring this program for the last 10 weeks. And I request Professor R. Prasad to initiate moderating these sessions, including the questions and answers. Over to you, Professor R. Prasad.
Thank you, Professor Sudhakar. And thanks a lot, Mr. Kaul, for enlightening us on many of the questions which have come up in the forum when we have asked for registrations. The very basics of what happened, I think, have been laid out in very, very simple terms that everyone can understand. And I think that's the beauty of the presentation. And we very deeply appreciate that. So we have laid out our questions in terms of sections. Some of those questions have got answered. And there are other questions. So we will take the first section, which basically is about, the what and the how. What is mad money? How do you classify it? I think you have responded to that. Are there other forms to bad money apart from what you have done? Does Bitcoin, NFT lead to bad money, or is it good money? The other, I'm just putting the cluster together so that you have a terrain to speak about. Does bad money affect good money? Is there a connection between black money, money laundering, and bad money? So this is the first set of questions.
Okay. So you want me to answer them now?
Yes.
Okay. So I will start with the connection between bad money and black money. Okay. So there is a clear connection. Now, what happened in case of quite a few of these loans, where that promoters essentially over projected the cost of the project. Okay, so the way it works is, let's say the cost of the project is 15,000 crore. You say that it will probably cost, you get some consultancy to say that it will cost 20,000 crore or 25,000 crore or something like that. Okay. And you say that you will bring in, let's say for a 25,000 crore project, the bank will probably give you a 20,000 crore loan, and you bring in your own 5,000 crores as equity. Now the thing here is to remember is that the actual cost of the project is only 15,000 crore and not 20,000 crore as you've projected. So once the bank gets in that 20,000, gives you the 20,000 crore loan, you essentially siphon off the difference of 5,000 crore in various ways. And in that way ensure that your contribution to the project, which should have been 5,000 crores, is essentially zero. And that 5,000 crores then becomes black money. Now, the problem is that there is nowhere to establish this 100%. I mean, this is what RBI governors and deputy governors have said on record in general terms. They have never named anyone. So So yes, a lot of bad money does become black money over a period of time. Bad money, and what was the other question? Good money. Can
Yeah,
you just
does bad money affect good money? And is Bitcoin, NFT bad money or good money or
okay.
something else?
Okay. So does bad money affect good money? Yes, it does impact good money. I mean, as I explained at the almost at the end of the talk, that there are costs attached with it. Now, if a bank has to be kept running, and people it had given out loans to have defaulted on the loans, the government needs to sort of put in money into that bank to get it going, to keep it going. Or to take the example of Yes Bank. Now, when Yes Bank collapsed some time back, the RBI had to arrange for a rescue, which was led by SBI and other banks. Now, obviously, all these banks, when they came together, they put in money to keep Yes Bank going, right? So that money had to come from somewhere. Now, when it came from somewhere into Yes Bank, obviously it wouldn't be spent somewhere else. So bad money has an impact on good money. Is Bitcoin good money, bad money? I mean, see, I will be, Bitcoin, a lot of people talk about its technology potential and all that. I mean, this is a very long topic, and I mean, you guys should invite me for a separate talk on this. But I'll give you a short answer on this. See, a lot of Bitcoin enthusiasts just look at Bitcoin and crypto from the point of view of technology. Okay, what they forget, and this is very very important, is that it is not just about technology, right? I mean, as if like someone told me on Twitter today, if technology was the only thing that made things work, then the Nokia smartphone would still be around, right? But who has ever used a Nokia smartphone? I mean, I have, and it was a pretty decent product, but it never really worked. So to give you a very simple example, if you study the history of money, and which I have, in the last 4,000 years, money usually has started as a private entity, but it has ultimately been taken over by the government. Now, by government, I just don't mean the elected government, the democratically elected governments of today, but even the kings and the queens and the general secretaries and everyone else who ruled and governed at different points of time. Now, there are three things that make a government a government. One, the first thing is the right to tax. The second thing is the right to legal violence. And the third thing is the right to create money out of thin air. Okay. So why do you think any government would want to share this right with someone else? That's a very basic question I have had, which nobody really has been able to give me a convincing answer for. Now, cryptocurrencies, essentially, anyone who understands the technology well enough can start a cryptocurrency in his own backyard, right? And there are enough examples of that. I mean, everything from Dogecoin to Scamcoin, your chances of survival are very low. Second point, which is again something people don't seem to get. Now, a lot of argument that people who believe in cryptos, the argument that is made is that you cannot create cryptos out of thin air, which is why cryptos are good, and which is why paper money as we have it is bad. Uh, what they don't understand is the simple fact that a single crypto, like something like you may not be able to create more Bitcoin, right? But you can keep creating cryptos, right? You can keep creating. There are thousands of cryptocurrencies going around. So the argument that cryptos cannot be created is doesn't really hold. The other point that I wanted to make is that if money, the way the cryptos, the way Bitcoin has been used, it has been used for a lot of illegal activity over the years. Okay, now no government can sit around saying that we can't do anything about it. So they have to crack down on it. And so these are the reasons which I feel that the enthusiasts do not understand the political and the economic part of it. They just keep talking about technology and keep and get carried away.
Thank you. That's very interesting, Mr. Kaul. I think the first part being that the black money does have an impact on the bad money, but it's pretty difficult to kind of estimate it. And at the same time that cryptos can be created and that there is a base of illegal activity, and that can also cause a certain level of bad money, how, etc. We may not know. So I think
I
there's a
think
vagueness.
there is one more point I forgot to make.
Sure.
Again, and this again comes from the reading of history. So if you read, if you read the history of the last 100 years, you will realize that paper money and democracy have risen hand in hand. Okay. Now, before paper money, pure paper money, I mean paper money not backed by anything except the assurance of the government. So before the First World War, almost paper money of all countries could be converted into gold. Okay, and this sort of gradually stopped happening after the First World War, and then it sort of went away after the Second World War. Now, but democracy has flourished. Now, what happens is in a scenario where paper money is backed by gold, the government cannot print a lot of paper money simply because the citizens have an option of taking that paper money to the bank and exchanging it for gold, and there is only so much amount of gold going around. So there is a limit on the capacity of the government to print paper money. The problem is, in a democracy, when an economic crisis hits, the government cannot sit around saying that we cannot print money because there is only so much amount of gold going around. So paper, so there are, this is a very nuanced point. Now, I'm not, someone might say that this guy is in favor of printing paper money. I'm not, but I am in favor of democracy. So this is another point that needs to be kept in mind, before we sort of get very bullish on the case of crypto, bitcoins and other cryptos.
Thank you. I think that is also a very, enlightening point. The fact that there's a relationship between paper money and democracy, and there's a certain level of answerability which we exercise in the democracy, which works in whatever way it works as of now. Thank you. I'll move to the next question. As you have rightly said, when you compare retail loans and corporate loans, big corporates get pretty easy loans. Small businesses find it extremely difficult. And when you look at it, what are the root causes for this problem? Yes, you have delved on some of the problems, but if you have to, get back to that again, what are the root causes for this entire thing? If you have to,
why small businesses don't get loans easily?
Yes.
Okay. See, it's at a very simple level. I mean, if you look at the RBI data for the last 5 years, the total amount of outstanding loans to micro, small, and medium industries is flat. It hasn't grown in the last 5 years. Okay. Whereas loans to large corporates has grown by a small amount. Now, one of the the straightforward reason why small businesses don't get loans very easily is because they are small. I mean, in the sense that it is not very easy for a banker to analyze and understand whether this guy is in a position to repay the loan. Now, that does not mean that the banker, can easily analyze a business, a big business. But I guess the assumption at the end of the day is that, the big business, big business has more of an incentive to survive than a small business. So this is not a problem, particular to India. This is a global problem wherein banks are reluctant to lend to smaller businesses because they really don't understand much about it. So
thank you. Yes, I think the MSME problem continues, though to some extent the knowledge and the power does exist.
No, I mean, that reason is there, but as I said, I can't really
yes.
I can't really establish that. So
yeah.
Also, there is another thing, when a moment a small business defaults on a loan, the banks unleash their lawyers on them, but they cannot really do that with a large business. So there is an old joke, and it essentially, I think John Maynard Keynes first said it, and my book also starts with that. And I would just like to quote, I would just like to sort of read out that line. Let me just locate it. Okay. So John Maynard Keynes essentially said that if you owe your bank £100, you have a problem. But if you owe your bank £1 million, it has a problem. Okay. The Economist then has its own version on this. And The Economist basically says, if you owe your bank £1 billion, everyone has a problem.
Too big to fail.
Yeah, which is precisely what that is. So
yeah. Is there some way for, commoners like us to understand what kind of, quantify the cost to society? I mean, at least the ones which are apparent due to bad money.
Yeah, I mean, see, you look at the fact that all the, a lot of big businesses defaulted on loans. And so, at the when I started my talk, I said that I always ask people who is the biggest defaulter of them all. And till date, no one's really given me an answer for it. So the answer for that is the biggest defaulter is a gentleman called Brij Bhushan Singhal, who used to run a company called Bhushan Steel. Bhushan Steel defaulted on 56,000 something crores. Bhushan Steel was ultimately bought by a subsidiary of Tata Steel, and it was bought for 35,000 crores. So the cost was, I mean, the haircut, as we call it, was 21,000 crores. So this was a cost that ultimately the society has to bear. And it's very very interestingly that if you Google for images of Brij Bhushan Singhal, you will barely get any. So see, that's the interesting point. While the business media was busy telling us that Vijay Mallya has fled and Nirav Modi has fled, and these people were ultimately small fry. I mean, in fact, again, to sort of give you a personal story here, when I started writing the book, I was like, Vijay Mallya is a bad man and all that. But by the time I ended writing it, I sort of felt sorry for the guy. And I mean, this is not to say that what he did was right, but I felt sorry for the guy that, there are bigger, much bigger defaulters out there sitting comfortably in their homes in Bombay and Delhi, and nothing has happened to them. So.
But I guess, Vijay Mallya is a better marketed as an identified life.
No, he's a very good example. But what happened was when Vijay Mallya sort of ran away in 2016. At that point of time, the bad loan, up until then, the banks hadn't really started identifying their bad loans as bad loans. So the media did not pick up on it because at that point of time, the total amount was barely around 1,50,000 crore. It hadn't reached that huge amount of 8 lakh crore wherein you really needed to put a face to the entire issue, and Nirav Modi provided them with that face. So.
I think there was an associated question which was asked by one of the members here. Banks had a lot of systems in place, and in all these cases, how come is it that they did not have, or is it that they did not work? What is underlying?
I mean, see, systems essentially, it's not. I don't think this was about systems. It was basically irrational exuberance in many cases. You ended up giving loans to projects which you thought will start and reap, and the promoters will end up repaying the loan. But when a project doesn't start and there is no cash flow, and there are so many other variables which are not in the control of the promoter or the bank for that matter, I mean, then it's not a question of systems. So systems the system would sort of start, what is a system now? There is something called as the banks have this, before a bank becomes a bad loan, before a loan becomes a bad loan, that is, it has been in default for a period of 90 days, it gets categorized as SMA, a special mention account. So, if let's say a loan has been defaulted for a period of 30 to 60 days, I mean, I'm not sure of the definition, but if 30 to 60 days, it becomes a SMA1 account. So special mention, account one. So this is a system which tells a bank that these are the guys who have, not repaid money for a period of 30 days or more, and they are likely to become bad loans, right? Now, when you are giving a loan, there is an inherent risk of the loan not being repaid. And when a lot of banks sort of fall over one another to give out loans, obviously the due diligence that they do is not really proper. So at that level, the system failed, and it was basically a function of the irrational exuberance that prevailed during that era, or the fact that the finance ministry encouraged them to keep lending. So, systems also only work to a certain extent. I mean, systems ultimately are run by human beings, and human beings are fallible.
Okay, so what we are getting at is that there's a certain kind of momentum during that particular age, and everybody followed that more than the systems. Was there, is there some figure on all this haircut that we have taken because of bad money, which is also a cost?
I mean, it can be calculated, but honestly, I haven't gone around doing that. But it is into quite a few lakh crores. See, there's another thing that needs to be mentioned here is that, banks write off loans. Okay. So if a bad loan has been a bad loan for a period of more than 4 years, the bank can write off that loan and remove it from the balance sheet of the bank. Now, what happens is that in India, this is called a technical write-off. So even though the loan has been written off from the balance sheet of the bank, at the local level, efforts to sort of recover a part of the loan continue. Okay, I mean, theoretically, this is how it is. But if you look at the total amount of written off loans which are recovered, I mean, the number is very, very, it's some, I mean, the last time I checked, it was around 15, 16%. So when basically, if I were to put it in very simplistic terms, there is not much of a difference between a loan waiver and a loan write-off. So.
Okay. So what that means is, the monies which are recovered are not as significant as one would want it.
Oh yes, but then see, that's also a function of the fact that we have our bankruptcy code, insolvency and bankruptcy code is not even 5 years old. I mean, we started the bankruptcy process only in early January 2017, from what I remember, right? So we're like 4.5 years old. So this is so to give you an example now. What happens is when a company, when the bankers decide to put a company through the insolvency and the bankruptcy process, they need to come up with a resolution plan. Now, the resolution plan is essentially a euphemism for being able to sell the company to someone else. Now, if the other guy wants to buy that company, he will not pay the entire amount of loans which have been defaulted on, right? He will pay what he feels is viable for him. So if you look at the recoveries in case of the steel sector have been pretty decent, because the steel was on, the steel cycle was going up. So obviously, when Essar Steel was sold and ArcelorMittal bought it, the recovery in that case was more than 80%. In case of Tata Steel buying Bhushan Steel, the recovery was some 63-65%. But on the flip side, when Alok Industries, which was a textile company, was sold to a consortium, I think, of Reliance and JM Asset Management, the recovery was very, very low because textile is not the flavor of the season. So see, a lot of industries in India right now have, are not using their capacity fully, right? So if you look at the capacity utilization numbers that the RBI puts out, the capacity utilization currently happening is around 70%. So on a whole, I mean, specifically, obviously, there will be differences, but on the whole, there is enough capacity in the Indian industry right now. And given that there is no real need to buy these, companies which have defaulted on the loan. So also what happens is, and this is where things get very interesting, is that if a company, if the bankers led by the resolution professional cannot come up with the rescue plan, then the company is to be liquidated, which basically means it has to be stripped and sold, part by part, asset by asset. Now, so to give you a very simple example, let's say a company which is defaulted on a loan has a factory, and the factory has some machines in it which can be sold. Now, in order to sell those machines, you need a proper system. I mean, you need a valuer who can value the machine. You need a company which is willing to buy it. You need someone who can get these people together. Then you need someone who can strip that machine from place A and take it to place B, where it is, where it will be required. So all these systems cannot be developed overnight. I mean, it takes decades for a bankruptcy process to evolve. And which is why, if you look at some of the recent haircuts, they have been huge, because those companies really are not really in demand, and the bankers, those companies are in sectors which are not really in demand, and bankers at the end of the day realize that if the company goes into liquidation, they are not going to get anything. So at least here, even if they get 5-10%, they get some recovery.
Thank you. I think that puts it into perspective. There's a connected question, which is the last question in this section. And that is, has this form of irrational exuberance been there in other countries, and have they suffered as much?
I mean, I really haven't studied this, so I can't answer this offhand. Have they suffered as much, part of the question? But yes, I mean, it has happened. It has happened in Sweden. It has happened in the US in the late 70s and early 80s. They used to have these thrifts, which were basically financial institutions which gave out home loans. They were not full-fledged banks. They were what in India we call housing finance companies. So they ran into a huge problem, and that was then, it was sorted out. Sweden had this problem. I think Malaysia also had this problem a few years back. But I really don't know whether how badly it impacted their economy. So.
Thank you. So there is something which is there in common, and we need to study that more. So that's a very good, though it has taken a bit of time, I think that's laid a pretty good foundation based on a lot of questions which have come up. I now hand it over to Professor Sudhakar for the next section.
Yes, thank you very much, Vivek. As always, the lucid and easy style is attracting many commoners like me to what you write and what you speak. Fantastic. I'm going to focus on the ways and means to tackle the bad money. We will probably rush through quickly, keeping in mind the time that we have already crossed. So according to you, how well thought out is the bad bank as a solution to NPAs, and what are the costs and benefits of the bad bank? Will the bad bank really achieve the purpose? Though 2 trillion is proposed to be transferred, many of these would be fraud accounts or where some diversion of funds are detected. It's a question mark. Will the bad bank take accountability for this? Will the purpose of cleanup of bank balance sheets be served? This is the first part of the question in tackling bad money.
Okay. So, I mean, I can, this is a very long, it's got a very long answer. And for people who are like really interested in understanding this in depth, me and Dr. Nupur Hetamsaria wrote a longish piece for the Economic and Political Weekly, which was published, I think, a couple of months back. So you can read that piece. But to answer your question, see, it all depends on how the entire process is incentivized. If if the bad bank is allowed to be run in a proper incentivized sort of way, wherein the people who run this institution are essentially given incentives to recover the bad loans that have been sort of not been repaid, then I think it can work. But if it is run like any other government institution where the employees will be penalized if they sort of sell a asset at a haircut, and if stuff like that happens, then I don't think it's going to work. So it depends on, it's too early to sort of call which way it will go, but it depends on what sort of incentives are set up. I mean, it's difficult to sort of go beyond this because this is a complicated question, and I would request people who want a detailed answer to read the EPW piece, please. So.
Sure. I think we'll request the audience to look into the 2-month-old article in EPW. I think it's easy to search and get that one. Yeah, thank you. The second part of the question is, what were the kind of gaps in the roles played by RBI and the government that led to this happening? Is there any mechanism being worked out by the RBI and the government, apart from the bad bank, to curb frauds in the Indian banking system? And also, is the regulatory system good enough both in terms of legal framework in place and the delivery of justice?
Okay, so I mean, I don't think I can answer all of this because I really don't have the answer, but I'll try and answer the RBI part of it, which is something I have studied, and I mean, I have a view on. Now, see, what happened between 2011 and 2014 was, the RBI practiced regulatory forbearance. It essentially looked the other way, and it let banks do what they wanted to do on the bad loans front. And this essentially came from the history of, bad loans in India. Now, in the early 1990s, the bad loans of public sector banks had grown to as high as 25%. Okay. And at that point of time, the RBI sort of did not, go hammer and tongs at banks. And the formula that was followed back then was that, they essentially let the banks heal over a period of time. So basically what happened was that over a period of time, the loan books of banks kept growing, and the bad loans as such they were, as a percentage of the overall loans of the banks, sort of kept shrinking. And by 2004, 2005, they had come down from some 25% to 3%. So basically, I think what the RBI was hoping was that a similar sort of thing would happen this time around, and the bank loan books will keep growing, and we'll sort of come out of it. But what happened, the problem was that, the Indian banking system in 13, by 2015 was significantly bigger than what it was in the early 1990s. So that is something they probably did not take into account. Also, it's very, so, Dr. Duveri Subbarao, who was the RBI governor between 2009 and 2008 and 2013, before Dr. Rajan came in. So he wrote a very good book called Who Moved My Interest Rate. So if anyone wants to actually understand how central banking works in India, in simple English, without any jargon, I mean, that is the book to read. Now, I sort of reread his book when I was writing Bad Money, to figure out what does he have to say, or what he had to say about bad loans, because a lot of these bad loan problems happened between 2011 and 2013, and there was not a single mention of bad loans in the entire book. So, which was quite surprising, given that Dr. Subbarao has otherwise been very, very honest, and the way he's written about his relationship with the finance minister and the finance ministers, both P. Chidambaram and Pranab Mukherjee, is very, very honest. So I sort of never could really figure out as to why hasn't he talked about bad loans, because it wasn't that the problem did not exist at that point of time. So I don't know, what was the internal thinking of RBI at that point of time. But my guess is that they thought that this would probably go the 1990s way, and we'll be able to solve the problem over a period of time. Regulatory structures, etc. I really don't know. I mean, I haven't gone into all that, so I don't think I'm capable of answering that question.
Well, so that was about reading of a situation from 90s to early 2000s, which was very different in terms of the ground reality. Picked up from what you said just now, what do you think about the low interest rates in India today? Are they justified? Is the RBI doing its job properly? What do you think of the transfer of reserves to the government, and how do you rate? I will avoid the last part. That was a little political, so I avoided that one.
Okay. So, my views on this are very direct. Anyone who's followed me for a period of time would know what I think of it. Now, what happens is that typically, what's the simplistic thinking that happens on this? The thinking is the RBI cuts interest rates, banks cut interest rates, companies borrow, people borrow, economy recovers. Okay. This is to put it in a very simple framework. Now, what people don't take into account is the fact that in India, a lot of people, there are people on the other side of the equation also. It's not just about the people who want to borrow money. It's also about the people who want to save money, right? Now, what do you think people who are and despite all the stock market and Bitcoin and crypto and all the hangama, people in India essentially still save money through fixed deposits, life insurance, small saving schemes, and the well-to-do buy real estate and land, and gold, of course. Now, the problem is the moment your interest rates are lower than your rate of inflation, what are you doing to people who actually live through those interest rates? Now, you have look at a lot of senior citizens, people like my parents. My father was a public sector employee, right? So he doesn't have he runs his house on the basis of what he has saved and the money that has been invested in fixed deposits, and the interest that comes is essentially consumed. Now, if that interest sort of goes down, how do you think that people in these positions are going to react? I mean, they're obviously going to cut down on their consumption, right? Now, while one can understand that when the lending crashes, your interest rates are bound to come down. I mean, that is a given. It's not like, the lending crashes, the banks cannot continue paying the same rate of interest. I mean, it is not viable. One understands that. But when on top of that, the RBI does everything to sort of print money and, do various other things to drive down interest rates, it creates a problem for the common man. And it impacts consumption in its own way. Now, this is something, given that, the belief in the fact that low interest rates lead to economic activity is so strong, people do not nobody researches, nobody thinks, nobody talks about the other side of the equation. Because at the end of the day, there can't be any lending without saving, right? So it is a process which feeds into, one feeds into another. So I think that in an economy like India, low interest rates also hurt the economy, and this is something that neither the RBI talks about nor any of the professional economists who work for think tanks and banks and other organizations. They don't seem to talk about. So I think it hurts the economy in its own way.
Great. So low interest rates also hurt the economy. We know that IBC, Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, is more of a curative for NPMS. What about overhauling the credit risk systems in banks? Will it not prevent bad loans itself?
So see, that is see it again. That in itself depends on so many other things. So if you look at, as I said at the very beginning, if you look at the retail loan NPAs, the retail and NPAs are very, very low, and the reason for that is the due diligence is proper, and obviously if a retail guy defaults on a EMI, you can threaten the shit out of him. Pardon my language here, but the same cannot be done with a corporate guy. Again, so see, what happens is again that systems are only of so much use because if there is crony capitalism involved, or if there is corruption involved, or if we are exuberant, then there is the systems really don't work at that point of time. Now the other thing that has happened in the last 5-6 years is that a lot of public sector banks, having gone through what they have become reluctant to lend money. Now this is human psychology. This cannot sort of this can't go over overnight. So there are it's not just credit risk systems are just one part of the problem. There are multiple other problems, including the fact that a lot of public sector banks, even though they have professionals, it's not like people running these banks are not good. They are good. It's just that they are not allowed to sort of run the bank the way it should be run. I mean, take the example of the fact that there is a Department of Financial Services that runs these banks out of Delhi, right? So so they really sitting in Delhi, what worldview do these IAS officers have? And in fact, there is something one columnist wrote about public sector banks. They can't even change a toilet without the approval of the finance ministry. So unless you let the people who are in managerial positions in these banks run the bank like it should be run, and you want to sort of run the bank out of Delhi, I mean, what credit risk systems will not make much of a difference.
Great. Systems are systems because systems are run by people essentially, and then it depends on the people who are running those systems. The next question is our money in private or public banks safe, and what happens when small finance banks sink?
Okay. See, I think this is a question I get asked all the time, and the answer I have for this is slightly different. I never really say whether a bank is safe or not, and honestly, that is not for you and I to figure out. What we need to do is we need to make sure that our money is safe. Okay, whether a bank is safe, no one knows. So how do you make your money safe? The first thing you do is you don't have all your money in one bank. So recently, in Bombay, in Maharashtra, a cooperative bank called Punjab and Maharashtra Cooperative Bank failed a couple of years back. And I mean, even though it has Punjab in its name, it doesn't have any branch in Punjab. It is primarily a Maharashtra-based bank. And some of the videos that were going around were so horrible. People who had cardiac surgeries scheduled had all the money in the bank. People who had to get their daughters married had all the money in the bank. So, one of the first things you need to do is to make sure that all your money is not in one bank. Okay? So spread it around, have one public sector bank, have one private bank, have one bank which is close to your home. So, what happens is a lot of people like dealing with cooperative banks or these smaller banks because they give you good service, So their thing is, if I go to a big bank, nobody talks to me. Now, the point is, okay, I understand that. So have some of your money in this bank which gives you good service, so that, whatever your daily expense, your regular expenses are, that can be taken care of that from that bank. But don't have all your money in one bank. This is, this is as basic as it can get. The second thing that one needs to do is that, again, it's a very basic thumb rule, that if the bad loans rate of a bank is more than 10%, don't have money in that bank. It is very easy. You just need to Google bad loans rate followed by the name of the bank. You will get or say gross NPAs followed by the name of the bank. You will get the rate. And if it is more than 10%, don't bank with that bank. Bank with, see, these days also, so I understand, people of a certain age have this problem wherein they are used to the idea of going to a bank, talking with the teller and then withdrawing money. So it's a part of their lives. Now, I can understand that. So which is why it is important, again, as at the cost of repetition, that you spread your money around. So the question to ask is not whether the bank is safe. The question to ask is, how do I make my money safe?
Fantastic. I think tomorrow morning I have to go to my bank. So not keep all the money, whatever little money we have, in one single bank. There is one associated question which I'm picking up before I hand it over to Professor Prasad. Why doesn't the government reduce the capital gains tax on sale of fixed assets and increase the market value of properties, as most of the black money goes into this portion of purchase of properties?
I don't buy that. I have a slightly different view on this. I think the Indian taxation system caters to the rich, non-salaried rich. Okay. And I don't think that is fair. So I firmly believe in the fact that any form of income should be taxed at the same rate. So all this because, not just because it is fair, but it also because it simplifies the tax system. I was a personal finance journalist for 7 years, and I was very deeply into all this. And till date, I can't figure out, I have to go back and look as to how capital gains on different assets are taxed. Just the capital gains part of it can give you a headache. So just, forget getting into all other things. I don't think it is fair that, interest on a fixed deposit is taxed at 30% marginal rate. But, if I invest in, in stocks, I only pay a tax, long-term capital gain tax of 10%, or a short-term capital gain of 15%. Or if I invest in gold, or I invest in property, I get indexation benefits. But if I invest in fixed deposits, I don't get indexation benefits. It's not like fixed deposit income is not impacted by inflation, right? I find the Indian tax system is rigged heavily in favor of the non-salaried rich, and that needs to change. And that can change if the tax system is simplified. The moment you simplify the tax system, your collections will go up, and you will be in a position to bring down rates automatically.
Great. You offer simplified tax system to maximize the collections. On that note, I request Professor R. Prasad to come in for wrapping up with a few questions from here on. Professor Prasad.
Thank you, Professor Sudhakar Rao. I think, there's one point which stood out about more autonomy to banks, which I keep, which I will remember from this previous discussion, because a lot of discussion was about banks and why certain things are not happening. I come to another question. How do you see the relative role of ethics versus governance in this discussion on bad money, particularly given that opportunities available with globalization and change? May not exactly be right now, but it will grow.
This is beyond me. See, ethics is a very, very it is a very individual thing, and at any given point of time, whether a person is being ethical or not, I don't know. I don't have an answer for that.
I'll come to a more direct question here. Now, what can educational institutions do, particularly higher education institutions, to contribute to a sustainable solution, so that we don't have this, may not be in the same size. We don't have this, coming up to this extent.
See, one of the things that that doesn't get done, that doesn't get done enough in educational institutions, is the fact that so you would probably, all educational institutes have a course in ethics. But the way it gets taught is so boring that I don't think anyone really takes home anything. So the subject, the way it is taught needs to be made interesting. Now, I'm obviously talking from my limited experience, and I mean, I'm sure, things might have changed. But but from what I have heard, from what I have seen, from what I have been through, subjects like ethics, corporate governance, I mean, they get the students don't take them very seriously. I mean, that is the students tend to take what they call these softer subjects not very seriously. And one reason for it is that they get taught in a very, very boring sort of way. So, let's say corporate governance. Now, in corporate governance, teachers will get stuck with models and theories and this and that. But the way it should be taught and especially in a business school, is from a totally example based point of view. I mean, let's say take the case of Nirav Modi and talk corporate governance, or take Vijay Mallya and talk corporate governance, or take any of these guys, take a Brij Bhushan Singhal, and talk corporate governance. So the approach to the entire process of learning has to change. While it is important to teach theory, the theory should come from from what has happened and not the other way around. So.
Thanks a lot. I think this is something that, we keep talking about. First narrate the story, then come to the moral.
Yeah, because what happens is people first tell you, give you the moral, and then by the time you've already lost your audience. So
yeah, we fully agree with you on that. I think, that kind of summarizes this section. We are also running short of time.
Professor, I would like to switch this question to you.
Yeah.
If you can take it briefly. From what Mr. Vivek Kaul has mentioned just now, in approaching the softer subjects, especially given the fact that most of the students are not generally interested in softer subjects, and the way it is taught is also not in the best of the manner that it is taught. In the newly designed online MBA program, or in your own experience of ICFI programs, how this has been taken care of? Is our case studies being plugged in going to solve the problem to some extent, or is there anything new that you are architecting into the online MBA program?
Yes, case studies is a generic approach. Yes, case studies do to some extent solve the problem, but I have another problem, and the problem is people are not listening in as much as you want them to.
No,
so if you give them.
Yeah, so see, what has obviously happened is, now, I mean, this is something I tell everyone, and people are, initially people didn't take me seriously on this, but now they do. Ultimately, we are in a world now where we are all competing with Netflix. Okay.
Yes.
Because we are competing for attention. So when I write and I want people to read, I am competing for their attention vis-a-vis, he or she has an option of watching Netflix. Okay. When you teach, you have to be very, very interesting so that they're not busy on their phones, either WhatsApping or watching YouTube or, Instagramming or doing something else. So we are all in the attention business now. And, some people suggest that we should ban mobile phones from the class, and all that is not going to work. The only thing that will work is when you are in a position, or rather when your content is so good that you have their attention.
I think you hit the the nail on its head, and this is what I was getting to, that what we are trying to do is we are trying to get to nano cases and micro cases. So what happens is, in this governance, you have things like Cadbury Committee, Kumaramangalam Committee. If you start talking about Cadbury Committee, nobody will listen to you. You have to take a nano situation, and then you have to say, okay, this is how it connects to Cadbury Committee. People will remember, okay, Cadbury, 1 point, this particular nano situation takes care of it. So we have been emphasizing this as a philosophy in our design. And I must tell you that it has taken quite a bit of effort to get even, good faculty members to think in that particular fashion. Because, normally you have this 1 hour, 15-minute session, and then you go. And then, it's a very serial thing. Learning cannot be serial. Learning needs to be objectified. If you've got 1 point in the Cadbury Committee, you need one example for that if you want to drive home that point. 100%. It is not, you don't need to get the guy to remember all the 20 points in that committee's report. If you get him to remember the important points, your job is done, and he'll remember you more in his life. Then I think that's the point, Professor Sudhakar, which I wanted to communicate.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much, both of you. I think you have built up a nice to-do kind of list for us. Uh, One for the road, I want to ask to Mr. Vivek. We seem to be having a lot of forex reserves. Can anything be done with that?
Oh, okay. So I have a column coming in Mint on Monday precisely on this issue. See, one needs to understand something. What are forex reserves at the end of the day, right? Forex reserves. When we talk about forex reserves, what are we talking about? We are talking about the foreign currency the RBI has and the gold that the RBI has, right? Now, where does RBI get its foreign currency from? RBI, buys dollars or any other currency for that matter by selling rupees. So when it buys dollars and sells rupees, the rupees that it sells becomes a liability for the bank, and the dollars that it buys becomes an asset for the bank, right? So there is already a balancing thing in place. So a lot of people suggest that we should spend the forex reserves. They don't get a basic understanding here that how will you spend it, because there is already, you cannot, you have already print money once in order to buy these dollars. So how do you print money on top of that? You can't. The only way to sort of use these forex reserves is to sort of borrow or to mortgage them, and like we did in 1991, we mortgaged our gold and we got money, and then we used that money to pay for imports. Now, obviously, right now we are not in such a position. So forex reserves have a certain use, and you need to see them from that point of view. Also, what a lot of these forex reserves are basically because of short-term debt. When money comes, when companies borrow dollars, or they are because of money that comes into the stock market, or they're because of money that comes into the bond market. So you have to understand that these are not permanent flows. The RBI does not really own them. I mean, it owns them at that point of time, yes, but there is a possibility that the money can go out, right? Also, one needs to one reason why our forex reserves have bloated in the last 1 year, and a lot of people don't seem to get it, is the fact that our imports have fallen much more than our exports. Now, what happens here is that when imports crash, obviously imports have fallen by around, last year, goods imports fell by around $90 billion. So obviously, that $90 billion was not required to pay for the imports. Now, at the same time, your exports also fell, but exports fell by something around $30 billion. So because of that, your forex reserves went up by $60 billion immediately. So not immediately, over a period of 1 year. Also, if you look at a lot of other, like people are not traveling abroad, people couldn't go abroad for education. So because of that also, lesser dollars were spent. But remittances, foreign remittances, continued coming in, even though, I mean, they fell, but they did not fall as much as the demand for dollars fell. So because of this, our forex reserves have gone up. Now, this is a situation which will not continue forever. Imports fell primarily because consumer demand came down. And one of the important things within imports that sort of the consumption fell was oil. So the oil demand came down, and oil demand came down because people were not stepping out of their homes. So the demand for petrol and diesel came down. So this is a situation which cannot continue forever. And ultimately, we will require these foreign exchange reserves to pay for imports and to repay our loans and so on and so forth. So it's a very unique situation, which is a function of the times that we are in.
Great. I think that is a wonderful session covering so many topics, subtopics, and concepts which otherwise are very difficult for us to understand. As I said in the beginning, thank you very much, Mr. Vivek, for keeping it simple, keeping it jargon-free, and identifying the underlying reasons for us to understand it very easily. I think many of us will go over this recorded session again, and we would love to read all your articles and books that are in the pipeline. And one word of wish is that more and more people should read your articles. Your website hit 8 lakh hits, I think, a couple of days back. I'm sure it is going to go up, and it should go up in my view. And while thanking you, I would also like to thank all the participants who have patiently listened to the entire session and asked many more questions. Actually, we could not take all the questions, but a large number of questions are covered in the explanations that you have given as part of answering the questions which were posed to you. Thank you, members, for joining us. We will see you again next week at 6:30 p.m. on Friday, that is July 2nd. And till then, I wish all the best to all of you. And once again, we'd like to sign off by thanking our esteemed guest, Mr. Vivek Kaul. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Kaul. Thank you.
Thank you, Vivek.
Thanks, Sanjay.